if you want to reuse some logic in your React applications, you typically will reach for custom hooks. You'll either implement them yourself or reach for some existing solutions. So there's some really great libraries out there like useHooks and also useHooks.ts that have all of these built-in hooks. And then there's React Use and also beautiful React hooks. And so these libraries are great, especially for the kind of things that we do over and over in every React application. We potentially don't want to write them from scratch every time. But there's a lot we can learn if we do write them from scratch. And so in this video, I'm going to implement useFetch from scratch. And so this is essentially a hook that manages requests with fetch, but also keeps track of your error state, your loading state, the data that gets returned from the fetch, and then also handles some more complex scenarios like canceling of requests and things like that. Now, you might be wondering, why would I want to write this from scratch when there are a lot of really good libraries out there? Essentially, this is a great way to practice and get better at writing React code. You're going to be using things like useCallback, useEffect, useState, and you're going to be pushing them to the limits. So instead of just your standard basic hooks like useState, you're going to really learn how things like useCallback and useEffect work. And so even if you don't want to watch me implement these, I highly recommend you try and build it out yourself. So I have this repo here, it's called useX. And for every one of these videos I create where I create a hook from scratch, I have a full test suite and documentation so you can try and implement it yourself. So if we take a look at useFetch, you can see that I have all of the requirements here. And so this describes how our specific useFetch hook is going to work, describes all of the arguments, what it returns, and all of its behavior. And you can make sure that your implementation matches all of this behavior. But beyond that, I also have tests. So aside from just checking boxes in a list, it's probably good to have these requirements codified as actual test code. And I've done just that. So if you want to practice implementing this useFetch function in this way, you can just run my test suite. And so here I have about 14 different tests that test all of these behaviors, and you can pull this repo down and give it a go. Try implementing the function. Now, if you take a look at the file here, you can see that we have default implementation, right? I've already defined all of your types. I've defined like the basic return, and it's kind of up to you to fill this out. So you're also going to get a lot of practice with TypeScript as well. You can see that we're using TypeScript generics and then a few other built-in React types here as well. So again, this is a great way to level up your skills in React and also in TypeScript. Now, for every hook that I build from scratch, I also provide a solution. So if you're trying to get the test to pass, but you're running into some issues, you can check out the solution. Of course, you're going to have to scroll past the warning, but beyond that, you can see my full implementation and see how I wrote the code to meet all of these requirements. Now, if you're new here, welcome. This is Syntax. Now, we have a podcast hosted by Wes and Scott. They publish 3 episodes every week that dive into all sorts of web development and programming related topics. So definitely check it out. And then here on the YouTube channel, I typically will do deep dives into some of the topics that are covered on the podcast or cover other topics that I find interesting as well, like implementing hooks from scratch. So definitely subscribe if that interests you. And if you want to see more of these hooks from scratch videos, definitely drop a like on the video and let me know what other hooks you would like to see. But without further ado, let's write this hook from scratch. My name is CJ. Welcome to Syntax. First up, let's clone down the repo. So I'll grab the URL here and then just do a git clone in my terminal here. Now we'll go into the directory and install dependencies. Great, let's open it up with VS Code. Now in here, if you head into the source directory, there is a folder for useFetch. Now in the folder is an example implementation. So if you're having a hard time kind of wrapping your mind around how this fetch is even going to be used, take a look at the example file, because in here we're using the hook. So for example, we can call useFetch, pass in our Pokemon type here, and then pass in a URL to get the information about Pikachu. And because we have immediate true set in our options here, whenever this component mounts, it should fire off a request to this URL and then update these state variables accordingly. And so if loading is true, we're going to show a progress indicator. If there's an error, we're going to show it on the screen. And if we actually have that Pokemon data, we're going to render it out here. And I essentially am just listing out all the stats and images and stuff like that. And then from there, our hook also provides a way to change the URL or the options dynamically. And so it also returns this function called update URL. And so within our code, we can call that with a new URL, and it will re-trigger the fetch with that brand new URL. So you can see here I have a button that says, if the URL is the Pikachu URL, update it to be the Charizard URL. Otherwise, update it to be the Pikachu URL. So it's just a simple toggle back and forth between Pikachu and Charizard. But in a real example, you might actually have a drop down where you can select the Pokemon that you want. And then once they select, that updates the URL, which then fires off this hook as well. So this is the hook that we're going to be implementing today. Now, if you take a look at the README, this has a full checklist of all of the requirements that need to be met in order to implement this hook. So you can use this as a checklist as you go, but all of these requirements directly line up with all of the tests. So if you take a look in the test file, this file has all of the tests that make sure your implementation of useFetch is meeting all of those requirements. Now, each of these tests uses the it keyword from vtest, but you can see that right now all of the tests are skipped. So from the command line, if you do p&pm test, you'll see that right now no tests run. Basically, everything is skipped. But if we want to start working on our first test, we can head in here and then just remove skip from this very first test. So these tests are written in a sequential way. So I recommend if you're going to use the test suite to implement your function, remove skip from each of these tests one by one as you make the test pass. So because I removed skip there, the tests are going to rerun and we're going to get a failing test. Because if you head back over here, we can see we have an empty useFetch file. Now I already have you set up with the proper typings for your return, and you can see that we're already accepting the correct arguments, but it's up to you to fill in the details here. Now I recommend if you're going to try to solve this yourself, pause the video here and go write some code, go make those tests pass. But I am now going to walk through my solution. So our first test says it should fetch unmount by default. So our test is looking for a call to the actual fetch function. And whenever our component mounts, in this case, it should call the fetch function. So let's do just that. Now I am going to use a use effect here because I only want to call the fetch once when the component mounts. So we'll pull in useEffect from React, specify an empty dependency array, and then in here, I'll just call fetch, and we can pass in that initial URL that gets passed into the hook. Now you can see here that I have a linter warning that says I am missing a dependency here. I'm going to go ahead and add it because we have tests that make sure we'll do things in the right way as well. Okay, so super basic. When the component mounts, we call the fetch function, and we have one passing test. So we can keep moving on from here. So first test passing, let's make another one pass. I'm going to uncomment this test here. We should get a failing test, and this one says that it should set loading when fetching data. So our hook needs to manage loading state. And right now you can see that it's just hard coding a return of false, but we should actually use a state variable for this. So I can create a state variable. Let's call it loading. And this is just going to be a use state. It'll default to false. And then now we will actually return that state value here. And then whenever we attempt to fetch, we should set loading to true, like so. And then afterwards, set loading to false. Now at this point, I actually do want to await this fetch because I'm not even doing anything with the return value, but I cannot await inside of a useEffect. So I'm going to go ahead and move this out into an async function, and I'm going to call it load because our hook also exposes a load function so that the user of our hook can reload the data anytime that they want. And so essentially I'm going to put all of the fetching logic inside of here. And so I'll have an async function, and then from there I will set loading to true, call fetch, and then set loading to false. And so now inside of my useEffect, I can actually just call my load function. Now we should listen to these linter warnings because again, we're missing load as a dependency, but watch what happens when we add load as a dependency. We get another linter warning. And essentially, if we define our functions at the top level like this, every single render, they get recreated, which means that this useEffect will get rerun on every render because load gets recreated on every render. And so if you look at this linter warning, it says, it makes the dependency of a useEffect hook change on every render. So this linter warning is super helpful, but essentially it's telling us we need to wrap this in a use callback so that it doesn't get recreated on every render. And this is one of the rare cases where, yes, you actually do need to reach for use callback. So let's do it. So I'm going to add a use callback right here, pass this whole function in, pass in my dependency array. We'll pull in that from React, and then we get a linter warning because we have a dependency on initial URL. And so we'll pass that in here. But now our useEffect is no longer dependent on initial URL. It's only dependent on the load function. So this should do it. Let me just give myself a little bit of breathing room here. And while I'm at it, instead of just returning a blank function, I'm actually going to return that load function that I defined here. So this is looking good. Basically, when the component mounts, it's going to call load. That'll set loading to true, call fetch, set loading to false. Is our test passing? It is. Moving right along. All right. Our next test says should set the data after the fetch. Yeah. So at this point, test is failing because right now our hook is returning data as null, but we need to actually update it to be the data that we got back from fetch. So inside of our hook, right now we're just hard coding data as null. We need a state variable to keep track of this. So I'll create a state variable data. And then we can do use state, and this defaults to null. And then our hook will actually return that data here. Now, by default, because I initialized this hook as null, you can see that it'll only accept the value null. I want data to also be type T that is passed in. And so if you're new to TypeScript generics, this is a really common use case for generics where essentially we want our fetch to be able to return typed data of any type, but we don't know what that type is going to be. So we just use this generic T. And we can actually use that generic type right here. So I can say this data state variable can be of type T, or it can be null. And if you take a look at our example usage over here, we're passing in the type as Pokemon. And so Pokemon is just a type that describes all of its properties. But essentially by having a generic type parameter like that, now the data property that's returned actually has that type. So we've set that up. Now we can actually get that data back from fetch. So I'm going to grab my response here, and then we will just parse it as JSON. So I'll say await response.json, and then we can set our data. So right here, I'll say set data with our JSON data. And we've got ourselves a passing test. Sweet. So we're setting the data. On to the next test. This next one says, should not fetch on mount if immediate is false. And so this is an option that our custom hook exposes. So if you look at that example implementation here, we're passing in immediate true. We actually want this to be the default option. I'm just passing it in the example so you can see that this accepts an object of options. But essentially, we want to make it so that someone can use our hook and it doesn't call the fetch function immediately. Because we also expose this load function, we can then allow the user of our hook to call load whenever they think it should be called, like in response to a button click or some user event. And so essentially, we want to be able to allow them to pass an immediate false and then not call the fetch function on mount, but still be able to call it whenever the load function is called. So if we head back over, we do have a failing test because right now our test is passing in immediate false, but we're still loading the data. So let's fix that. So you can see that our hook is also taking in these fetch options, which has that immediate property. And so what we could do is use it right here and say, if options.immediate is true, then call the load function. But it's possible that they don't pass in any options at all, and we want it to default to true. So I'm actually going to put this into a state variable. So here I'm going to have options and then set options, and then we'll just do a use state. And the initial value will be those options that they passed in. But if they didn't pass in anything in, this will be undefined, and we want to just default it to immediate true, like this. And so now here inside of our useEffect, we can say if options.immediate is true, then call the load function. And so now if options get passed in and immediate is false, it will not call that load function whenever the component mounts. And in this case, you can see that we are missing a dependency. So we definitely want to pass that in here as well, like so. And we have a passing test moving right along. Now, this next one is super important to prevent like infinite render loops. And so this test says should not rerun if new options passed in directly. So if we take a look at the Pokemon example, right now, these options are being passed in as an object, but it's just a bare object, right? And by the rules of React, every time this component renders, technically this is going to be a brand new object. And so if our hook was just looking at that object directly, it would be a new object on every single re-render. So we want to make sure that we are not just using that value directly, we're kind of wrapping it in our own state variable, which we've already done. Instead of using initial options and having a dependency on it directly, we wrap it into our own state variable. And so now on a re-render, even if a brand new object gets passed in here, it's not going to cause an update of our hook because we captured that initial value when the hook was called. Now, the API of our hook actually exposes a function called update options so that from the outside world, if the user of a hook does want to change those options, they can call this function directly. So essentially what we can do is just expose this setter functions as update options. So I'm going to rename it to update options and then return that here. And so that looks good for options. Now, one other thing we need to do is actually pass in the request options here whenever we're making the fetch. So we essentially allow the user to pass in a request in it so they can set the method, the URL, any custom headers or anything like that. And so we actually do need to pass that into our fetch. So a similar thing would happen, right? If we pass this in directly, and then also set a dependency on those request options, now when the component re-renders, we're getting a brand new object here. So that callback would have gotten recreated. And so we can see our tests are failing right now because the tests are simulating a re-render with brand new objects, but they're not calling our update function. And we actually are re-rendering. So we want to take care of that. And we'll do the same thing with request options. So essentially, we're going to have a state variable that's going to be request options. And then also we'll expose that update request options function. We'll do a use state, and I can pass in those initial request options here. And so now instead of being dependent on the initial options, we can actually use our state variable here. So I'll pass it in the dependency array here, and I'll pass it in here. And then we can also return this function. So we're essentially exposing that updater function. So if the outside world needs to update the request options or the options, they'll call that function directly instead of passing in a new value. Okay, so this looks good, but there's one more update we need to make. Can you spot it? Because our tests should still be failing. Yeah, our tests are still failing. And that's because we also need to handle the URL. And so if this gets called again with a different URL, for our implementation, we don't want to recall the fetch. Now, you could create a useFetch function that works in that way, but essentially I want to expose an update URL function just like I did for these others, so that if the user of our hook needs to change the URL in response to some user action, they can call that function directly. So again, we need another state variable. We're going to call it URL, and we're also exposing that setter function so that they can update the URL if they would like to. So here we're going to say a use state. It'll be set to the initial URL. And now we'll use our state variable here instead of the initial URL that got passed into the hook. And then of course we can expose our update URL function as well. And so we'll return that here. And so now we should have some passing tests. So essentially the tests were re-rendering the component with new values passed in every time and making sure that it's not actually making a new request, even though the arguments here change. Because the only way to actually update the request is to call these functions directly. And we have tests for that later on that'll make sure that these update functions work in the right way. Okay, so if we head back over, we have a passing test. Awesome. Now our last test here is should set error if the URL is empty. Now this is just implementation specific, but in this case, we just want to throw an error if for whatever reason they pass in an empty URL like this. And so if we run the tests, we can see that right now it's actually attempting to fetch even though the URL is empty. And so we'll actually handle that here inside of our load function. We'll just say, if the URL is empty, then we want to set an error. So if you look at our test, they're checking to see, did we set the error property to be empty URL? So they're explicitly looking for that string. So right here, I need to set an error variable. And so this is one more internal state variable that we're going to call error. So here we'll grab our error and then set error. And this is going to be a state variable that starts off as null, but can also be a string. So this is another scenario where we need a type union. So it can be a string or null. And then here, if there was not a URL, we'll say set error. We'll pass in that specific empty URL error. And then in this case, we don't want to fetch at all. We want to set the error and then be done with it. So I'm just going to do an empty return. So if our hook is called with an empty URL, it just sets the error, doesn't set loading or anything else. And now that we have our error value, we should actually return it from our hook. So here we're going to return that. And while I'm thinking about it, I should have done this during the last test, but we also have this internal state variable, which is like the current URL set, and we want to expose that to the outside world as well. Okay, so we've got that. Now, if we take a look at the tests, they're passing because if the URL was empty, we set the error, we don't set loading, we don't call fetch or anything else like that. Awesome. Now, I would wager that most of you that have implemented a hook like this at home or at work or wherever you write your custom hooks have probably stopped here. But we need some error handling, right? What happens if fetch throws an error? What happens if parsing JSON throws an error? We are not handling that case. And so for this hook to work well in a lot of different use cases, we need to make sure that we handle those errors. So if we head back over to the tests, we've got our error handling suite. And our first one is it should handle network errors correctly. So essentially, if fetch throws an error, we should handle that. And so if we take a look at our test runner, we get a very weird error because there is an unhandled rejection. Essentially, when our hook calls fetch, it's immediately throwing a network error and we're not handling that. And the way to handle that is with a try catch. So I'm actually going to wrap this in a try catch like so. And then if there was an error, I'm going to set it as the error message. And so when you're using TypeScript, the type of this error here is unknown. We know that the only type of thing that gets thrown is an actual error object. So I'm going to put it into a variable with that type. So I'm going to say error is E as capital E error, because if fetch throws an error, that's going to be a capital E error. If there's a parsing error here, that's going to be a capital E error. And so now that we have an error object, we can, for instance, get access to like the message value. And that's what we'll do. So right here, I can say set error and then just pass in error.message. And so if fetch throws an error and the message is network error, that's the error message that we're going to see here. Great. And with that, we have a passing test. Now, our next test makes sure that we handle JSON parse errors correctly. And we should still be fine because If either one of these throw an error, we're still setting our error message here. But there's a difference between fetch throwing an error and then this response.json throwing an error. And so if we unskip this next test, it's actually simulating what if that JSON function throws an error, not the fetch function throws an error. And so with that, we're still handling it in the same way. Okay, so our custom hook is looking pretty good. Now we actually need to test to make sure that these update functions work. So if the outside world calls update URL, does it refetch the data? Or if they update the options, or if they update the request options, is our fetch function going to get recalled? So we will uncomment our first test, which is should refetch if the URL is updated. And it already works because we set it up earlier, right? So because we added it to our dependency array here, and we expose the update URL function to the outside world, when the outside world calls update URL, that's going to update this state variable. This is going to re-render. It's going to see that that dependency changed, and load is going to get recreated. And then from there, because this use effect is dependent on load, load is going to get reinvoked. So because we've already set up these things in this way, it essentially already has that behavior where if the outside world calls that function, the fetch function will get recalled. Great, so that looks good. Our next one is should refetch if the request options are updated. I have a feeling this one's gonna pass too. Yep, again, because we set up those state variables. And then the next one is if options are updated. So let's remove the skip from that. Again, the test pass. Okay, lastly, should refetch if the load function is called. And again, we've already set this up in a way where that should work. Because we've defined this load function here and we're exposing it from our hook, the outside world can just call it directly. And so that's what this test is going to do. Essentially, it's going to load the hook and then afterwards call that load function directly and make sure that it actually did reload the data. And again, because we exposed that load function, we're good to go. Now, at this point, you're probably thinking, how on earth could we have more tests? We were testing all of the scenarios, right? We need to think about request cancellation. Now, if you look at the docs for fetch, fetch accepts a request init, right? That's the type of the request options that we've defined inside of our custom hook. But if you look at request init, it also supports a signal option. And this signal can be an abort signal. So there's this API called the abort controller, where essentially the fetch can be canceled from the outside world. So a signal gets set to a signal from abort controller. And then even if that fetch is in progress, if that signal is aborted, it'll stop that fetch mid-flight. Now, if we look at an example here on MDN for the abort signal, we can see an example with fetch. So they made a fetch request here, and then they have an abort signal that is going to abort in 5 seconds. And so if this fetch takes longer than 5 seconds, the abort signal is going to get fired. If that's the case, the error that gets thrown has a name of abort error. And so for our codes, essentially all we need to do is check to see, does the error have a name of abort error? And if it does, the request was aborted and we can handle it in that way. So let's do it. In our tests, we're going to uncomment this one. So should clear data and not set error when aborted. So essentially, if the request was aborted, we want to set data to null, set loading to false, set error to null, essentially reset all of our state if the request was aborted. And we can handle that right here. So just like in the example we saw over here, if the name is abort error, handle it accordingly. So right here, we'll say if error.name is equal to abort error, we'll do this. Otherwise, we're actually going to set that error, right? Because if it was a network error or a parsing error, we still want to set it. But if it was an abort error, our specific hook doesn't want to set anything. It's essentially just going to clear out the data. So in this case, I'll set data to null and also set the error to null. So reset everything if this was an abort error. And then we're always setting loading to false. And so if the request was in flight, it then throws an abort error. The codes here will get run, which resets our data, and then we'll set loading to false. And so with that, that test is passing. Now, our next test makes sure that we're in a consistent state. And so because we provide that load function, right, the user of our hook can call that load function whenever they want. Our behavior is that if that load function is called, we also want to clear out the state, right? We want to reset data, we want to reset error. And so this next test is going to make sure that if load is called again, the previous data gets cleared out before it attempts to request the next set of data. And so let's unskip this test. We have a failing test because it's expecting that data to be null. So this is another thing we need to do whenever the load function is called, clear out the existing data. And now the tests are passing. This next one says should clear the existing error if the load function is called. So we'll unskip this one. So essentially what this is testing is it calls our hook, but does it in a way that throws an error. And then it calls the hook again. And it wants to make sure that the next time it's called, that error is actually cleared out. And so similar to how we're resetting the data, we also want to set the error to null as well. And so right here, we could just set error to null right above this like that. But then potentially I would be setting the error twice if the URL was empty. So I'm just going to actually add an else statement here. So if there was not a URL error, then we'll set the error to null. And like that, we have a passing test. Now these next tests deal with us providing our own abort controller. And so essentially what we want to happen is if our load function is called multiple times, like in quick succession, we actually want to cancel the previous requests. Right? And so we already talked about this abort signal API. And so essentially we're going to need to create one of our own inside of this hook. So that way, if a call to load comes in and a previous request was in progress, we can call signal.abort to abort the previous one. So let's try to implement this. So first we'll uncomment this test. Should abort previous fetch if load is called while fetching. So essentially the hook will make a request for one thing, but then while that request is in progress, the load function will be called again for a different thing. And we need to make sure that that first request is canceled and we only hold on to the response for that second request. So now with this saved, you can see the test is failing. And the way that it's testing this is we're making sure that the data that got set is the data that got set by the second request. Because in our example, the first request actually responds later. And so it actually sets the data to be the response of the first request. So the way we're going to handle this is by creating our own abort controller inside of our hook. And so for this, we need to hold on to that abort controller, right? Because we need to be able to cancel the previous request inside of the hook. So you might reach for use state. Let's see what this looks like by using use state. So let's say I have an abort controller, and then we have set abort controller, and then we'll do a use state. And in this case, I'm just going to pass in a new instance of an abort controller. Now, essentially what I need to do is pass in the signal of this abort controller into our request options. So here I'm going to define my request init. That's going to be those request options that got passed in, but those could be undefined. So I'm going to set it to an empty object otherwise, because from there, I want to set the signal property. So we can pass the signal in, and we're going to set it to be abort controller dot signal. And so now if this signal is aborted, then this fetch will not complete. It'll throw the error and then just do nothing. And so for this to work, basically anytime the load function gets called, it needs to cancel the previous request if the previous request hasn't completed. And so the way to do that is just say abort controller dot abort. So the previous request gets canceled, and then we actually need a new abort controller because you can't abort it multiple times. So essentially what we would do is reassign it. So here we would say set abort controller to be a new abort controller. But you'll see our dilemma because down here, we need the latest one. And now because we're also using a state variable, we actually have to pass that abort controller in here as a dependency. And so that means if we're like setting state inside of something that requires state and it's a dependency, it would create like an infinite loop. So the way to get around that is to use a ref instead. So instead of storing our abort controller here inside of a use state, we're going to do a use ref. And now we'll have to access the current values. So here I can say abort controller.current and then call abort. But now I can override that current value without having to call a set state. So here I can say current is a new abort controller, like so. But down here, to get access to that signal, I do need to say .current. And then here we need to pass in that request init instead of the default request options. And so now the signal is actually passed into the fetch here. And so if it's aborted, this fetch is going to throw an error. And just like that, if this load function is called in quick succession, or it's called before this request completes, it's going to abort the previous request, which will stop this from completing, and then create a new abort controller and then make a new request. Now, another thing we'll do is if the request was aborted, we don't want to set our data here because it's possible that we hit like this race condition where it was canceled, but then we're still setting it here. So we actually want to check that. However, we can't just look at current, right? Because every time this gets called, we're overriding current. In the current scope of this fetch, we need access to the current abort controller and not the reassigned one if this method got recalled. So I'm going to create a variable called current abort controller and then just set that equal to current here. And so now this basically captures that value inside this scope. And so if the load function gets called again, abort controller.current is going to get overwritten, but my local variable here will still be the previous one. And then we can do some checks here. So here I can say, if the signal was aborted, then do nothing. So essentially you made it past all this, but the signal was already aborted. Now in most cases, it'll actually throw while the fetch is in progress, and then it'll get caught by our current error handler. But we always want to check for that just in case there's some kind of race condition. So we'll save that. And now we have a passing test. Now the very last thing is we also want to abort requests if the component is unmounted. So if someone navigates away from this page and there was a fetch in progress, we want to cancel that request. So let's comment out that last test, which is should abort a request in progress if unmounted. And the way that we're going to handle that is with our disposal function. So useEffect can return a function, and this is our disposal function. So essentially we can do anything here to dispose of resources, or in this case, cancel a request. So this function is going to get called anytime this useEffect is torn down. So anytime the component is re-rendered or anytime the component is unmounted. And that's the main reason we need to do this here. We're already handling re-renders because we're canceling the request at the top of the load function here. So if the load function is called again, we're canceling the previous request. But if a request is in progress and then the user navigates away from this page and the component gets unmounted, we need to call abort as well. And so we'll do just that. Essentially, in our disposal function, we will abort the request in progress. And so when the component is unmounted, the in progress request gets aborted. And with that, we should have our last passing test. Nice. Now that's it for this video, but thank you so much for watching. Now, if you'd like to see me implement other hooks from scratch, let me know down in the comments, which hook would you like me to implement? And there's a lot to choose from. So all of these hook resources are going to be linked in the description as well, so you can check these out. And also, if you have your own ideas for custom hooks that maybe aren't in these libraries yet, suggest that as well, because it could be fun to see how I implement it from scratch. All right, that's it for this one. I'll see you in the next one.